The Island After the Story. Britain, Empire, and the Anger That Remains. From Piers and Tucker's studio to Dickens's slums, migrant hotels, and small screens, why Britain's past was never the paradise we remember. And why that's good news. By Elias Winter, November 27th, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Chapter 1. In the studio, 2 men, 1 island, and a missing word. The first time I watched the clip, I didn't really see a studio. I saw a room that could have been anywhere. 2 men in chairs, 2 faces under good lighting, a country placed between them like an object on a table. Piers Morgan sits the way he always does, as if he's halfway between a pub argument and a courtroom cross-examination. Tucker Carlson leans back, eyes narrow but alive, doing that thing he does where he looks a little amused and a little incredulous at the same time. They're talking about Britain, not about ratings, not about this week's scandal, about a country, an island that once painted half the planet pink on the map and now feels, at least to them, like something smaller, more tired, less sure of itself. Tucker asks the question that hangs over the whole conversation. What happened to Britain? Why did it change? I pause the video. Not because the question is stupid, but because it's too important to leave in that room. I have a strange relationship with these men. On a good day, I can say honestly, I don't hate them. I don't even dislike them. Piers Morgan annoys me in the same way a loud restaurant does. Too much clatter, too many plates in the air. His show often feels like a gladiator pit he's hired out by the hour. Drag someone in, poke them, see if they bleed well on camera. And yet, I like that he's willing to argue. I like that he doesn't evaporate the second someone pushes back. There's a basic honesty in someone who will stand there and be shouted at rather than retreat behind a PR statement. With Tucker, it's different. He wears his anger openly, like a coat he forgot to take off when he came inside. Sometimes he's funny, sometimes reckless, sometimes plainly cruel. But if you ignore the monologue and just look at the eyes, there is something else sitting behind them. Grief. People think anger and grief are different emotions. They aren't. Anger is grief that refuses to sit down. Anger is grief with its shoes still on. I know this because I've spent years watching my own anger, peeling it back like an onion until nothing was left but sadness. Sadness at what my adopted country has done to itself, at what my birth country became, at what we could have been and chose not to be. When I look at Tucker, I don't see a cartoon villain. I see a man who loves his country and feels it slipping away. A man for whom the distance between what America thinks it is and what it actually is has become unbearable. It comes out as fury, sarcasm, contempt. Underneath, it's grief. But the problem with grief on television is that grief doesn't sell. Outrage does. That's where my allergy begins. Both of these men are wealthy. Both make their living in an economy where attention is currency and controversy is a business model. You cannot be indifferent to that if you want to be honest about the room we're in. It doesn't make them fake. It makes them professional. Their job is to say the most emotionally dense version of whatever they think in the shortest possible time, in a way that will be clipped, shared, praised, hated, and fed back into the machine tomorrow. My job is different. I sit in a small apartment, often in the dark, paid by an entirely different world. Data, algorithms, products. No one gives me a bonus for being provocative about Britain. No advertiser calls me and says, "Could you please make the next essay more inflammatory? Our engagement is down." I don't need Britain as content. I need Britain as a place I once knew, walked, loved, and left. This doesn't make me more virtuous. It just means I can afford to say certain things that would be financially suicidal on television. I can let a thought breathe. I can follow a feeling past the point where it stops being marketable. So when Tucker and Piers sit in that studio and talk about Britain like 2 disappointed landlords arguing over the state of an old property, I find myself wanting to step into the frame, not to shout them down, but to prise the window open a little wider. Because something is missing from that room. At one point in the conversation, Tucker says he is originally British. There is a pride there, half joking, half serious. His grandfather or great-grandfather, I don't remember which, was born there. The bloodline lets him claim a sliver of the island as his own. I understand that impulse. I have my own ghosts like that. But I also know this. If you spend years living on those islands, reading their history, walking past their statues in the rain, if you fill your head with Dickens and Orwell and the strange, stubborn decency of ordinary British people, something happens that has nothing to do with DNA. Westminster stops being just a British building. It becomes part of the inner architecture of your mind. Isaac Newton stops being their scientist and becomes one of the foundational stones of the world you inhabit. Shakespeare isn't their writer. He's everyone's ancestor now, whether Britain likes it or not. Belonging isn't only blood. Sometimes it's attention. Sometimes it's how much of your heart you've spent trying to understand a place. So when someone with a television studio and 1 million viewers says, "Britain used to be great," I want to ask gently, which Britain? The one on your grandfather's passport? The one in old films? The one in history books filed under glorious? Or the one under Dickens's feet? This is where the conversation in that room starts to drift away from the center of the thing. Tucker's question is emotionally honest. What happened to this country? The way he frames it is not. He asks why Britain interfered when Hitler invaded Poland, as if Britain were a small, peaceable island that one day simply wandered into a continental bar fight it could have avoided. As if Britain's normal state was to mind its own business and 1939 was an anomaly. It sounds reasonable enough, until you remember one word that neither man says out loud. Empire. You cannot talk about Britain in the 20th century, or the 19th, or the 18th, without using that word. Doing so is like discussing a whale and leaving out the ocean. Britain did not suddenly interfere in European affairs out of excessive moral enthusiasm. For more than a century, it had been the preeminent imperial power in the world. It had bases, colonies, protectorates, and interests scattered like seeds over multiple continents. Its navy literally enforced the rules of global trade. Interfering beyond its borders wasn't a quirky decision. It was an operating system. That doesn't mean there were no moral motives at all in 1939. People were genuinely horrified by what Germany was becoming. But to talk about Britain's decision to go to war only in terms of principle, as if it were a small island reluctantly joining somebody else's drama, is to strip the story of its basic anatomy. The same thing happens when people talk about decline without asking, decline of what? A neighborhood? A GDP curve? A myth? In that studio, the word Britain floats around like a brand. An old label on a faded suitcase. You can feel the weight of nostalgia in the way they say it, the grief for something that feels gone. But the thing they're grieving is not just a country. It's a story about that country. A story in which it was always righteous, always strong, always orderly, always enviable. That story was never entirely true, but it was useful. It held people together. It gave a frame to their sacrifices and their boredom, their small lives and their big wars. When that story cracks, people feel it in their bodies. I don't blame Tucker for feeling the crack. I feel it too in America. That's another declining empire, another place where the gap between self-image and reality has become an abyss. I know exactly what it feels like to wake up one day and realize the story we were told about ourselves is gone, and nothing has replaced it yet. The anger that follows isn't fake. The grief isn't fake. The temptation to reach for scapegoats or for a golden age that never quite existed is enormous. But this is where our paths part. When Tucker speaks about real Americans and real countries, there's a rhythm to it that feels like ownership. As if the nation is a house and he is the landlord and the rest of us are tenants. Recent arrivals, subletters, people who should be grateful for a room and not complain about the plumbing. I don't accept that arrangement in America, and I don't accept it for Britain either. No one owns Britain, not the royal family, Not the nostalgic, not the angry pundits, not the men who died in its wars, not the tourists who wave its flag at football matches. Britain, like every serious country, has escaped the custody of its original bloodlines a long time ago. It lives now in its language, its laws, its streets, its books, its habits, the way its people queue and apologize and quietly endure. And in those of us who came from elsewhere and loved it enough to stay for a while and then leave. So this is not an essay against Tucker Carlson or Piers Morgan. I don't find that interesting. They are symptoms, not causes. This is an essay through them. I want to start in that studio because that is where millions of people encounter the question, what happened to Britain? I want to acknowledge that the question is real and the grief is genuine. But I don't want to stay in the frame they built for it, where Britain is a fallen Eden and the villains are conveniently contemporary. I want to step outside the cameras, into the older light, into the slums that wrote Dickens's sentences, into the boarding houses and bomb sites that shaped Orwell, into the long corridors of empire that stretched from London to Lagos to Lahore and back again, into the present, where small boats cross cold water and teenagers in council estates scroll past Instagram mansions on cracked phones. I want to talk about Britain not as a lost paradise, but as a real place that was never as clean as its myths and never as hopeless as its critics. There is anger in the West today, yes. Some of it is justified, some of it is childish, most of it is confused. Behind much of it sits the same thing I see when I pause that video on Tucker's face. Grief at a story that has stopped working. If this essay has a purpose, it is this: to tell a truer story about Britain, one that can survive the end of its empire, the loss of its illusions, and the noise of its commentators, and still end, somehow, on a note of love.
Chapter 2. How Empires Actually Behave. Physics, not fairy tales. If you strip the flags off a map and just watch the arrows, history starts to look less like a morality play and more like a circulation system. Lines of ships, caravans, armies, cables, trade routes, invasions, telegraph wires, undersea internet. Power doesn't sit still. It moves. Why did Britain interfere when Hitler invaded Poland? Tucker asks. Because Britain was not, and had not been for a very long time, a man minding his own garden. It was a man with warehouses on every street and keys to other people's houses. You can argue about whether that man was sometimes polite or occasionally generous. You cannot argue about the fact that he was everywhere. An empire is not just a big country. A big country can be large and inward-facing. Lots of land, lots of people, and very little interest in the outside world. An empire is different. An empire is a state that has figured out how to make other people's land, labor, and markets part of its own nervous system. Sometimes that's done by planting flags and governors. Sometimes it's done with banks, navies, and advisors. Sometimes it's done with infrastructure and treaties that look generous until you read the small print. But the principle is the same. Decisions in the center rearrange lives in the periphery. Wealth from the periphery feeds comfort in the center. Once you see that, Britain's behavior in the 20th century stops looking like random interference and more like reflex. A century before Hitler, another conqueror from another small corner of Europe marched east with a head full of destiny. Napoleon, the Corsican who believed France ought to be stitched tightly over the whole continent like a fitted sheet, drove his armies toward Russia. His logic was not mysterious. Dominate Europe, control trade, starve rivals of options. He spoke the language of liberty and modernization, but the shape of the project was the old, familiar one. Make the map bend around me. Hitler, many years later, would rehearse a similar move, with a more openly murderous doctrine. He didn't invent the idea of eating your neighbors. He added a meticulous racial theology and industrialized genocide to a pattern Europe already knew by heart. Two men, two ideologies, one shared addiction: expansion. We like to imagine empires as grand strategic brains, but most of the time they behave like organisms with a simple instinct: outward. More. Again. The British Empire was one of those organisms. Its admirals and civil servants could tell themselves sophisticated stories about law, order, Christianity, civilization, the white man's burden. But the underlying code, the thing that made decisions predictable, was much simpler. Protect sea lanes, block rival powers, secure resources, keep the periphery from slipping away. So, when a Germany under Hitler starts swallowing countries and threatening to dominate the continent, the question in London is not, shall we randomly interfere? It's, if that continent falls under one hostile power, what happens to our own system? You can layer morality on top, and many did. There was real horror at Nazism, real belief in certain lines that must not be crossed. But empire doesn't wake up one morning and become altruistic. It defends itself. Sometimes, by defending itself, it genuinely helps others. That doesn't change the basic engine inside the machine. If you zoom out further, you start to see Britain's Germany problem rhyming with America's China problem. Two large powers whose economies and security arrangements depend on far-flung webs of influence, supply chains, bases, alliances. Two powers watching a rival grow in strength, watching shipping routes and semiconductor factories and rare earth mines become sites of quiet, permanent tension. What America today politely calls pivoting to Asia is just empire speak for. There's another center of gravity forming over there. We're going to stand closer to it and make sure it doesn't pull the world out of our orbit. None of this means the people in charge wake up in the morning twirling mustaches, dreaming of domination. It means they live inside a system where certain anxieties are built in. Someone controls the choke points, or no one does. If no one does, chaos. If the wrong someone does, disaster. Better us than them. That's how empire thinks, even when it quotes human rights and international law. That's how Britain thought in 1939, even when it spoke of honor and treaties. That's how America thinks now, even when it speaks of rules-based orders and freedom of navigation. This is why I called decline physics earlier. But I need to be careful with that word. No one passes a law of empire in a laboratory. There is no chalkboard in the sky listing theorem. All empires shall collapse in exactly X years. History is messier than gravity. Choices matter. Reforms can postpone crises, soften landings, avert specific wars. But there are patterns. The moment a state starts projecting power far beyond its borders, it inherits a permanent headache. The farther the reach, the more friction. The more friction, the greater the cost. The greater the cost, the more strain back home. Peripheries resist again, resist better. Rivals adapt, copy, sabotage. Technologies shift. Populations age. What was once a profitable arrangement starts to feel like holding on to a struggling animal. You need more and more effort just to keep the leash from slipping. You can't prove this on a blackboard, but you can watch it. In the Roman legions stretched thin along frontiers. In Spanish silver turning to inflation. In Ottoman reforms failing to keep pace with a changing world. In British governments realizing, after 2 world wars, that they no longer had the money or men to keep the imperial scaffolding intact. None of these collapses were single decisions. They were sequences, like a body getting old, not because anyone chose degeneration, but because the maintenance costs of being alive accumulate. When Dickens was describing London's underbelly, Britain's global power was still rising. When Orwell wrote about language and power, the empire's formal end was only just beginning. If you plotted British strength as a naval chart, those decades would look like high tide. But if you walked the streets, into the workhouses, coal mines, colonies, you would see the seams straining. Children bent over in factories. Famines and uprisings in territories no one in London had ever visited. The periphery already pushing back. Quietly. Endlessly. From the top deck of the imperial ship, the world still looked orderly. From below, in the boiler room and the cargo hold, the heat was already unbearable. Decline, in that sense, doesn't start on the day a flag comes down. It starts when the cost of keeping the world arranged around you becomes greater than the benefit, when the stories you tell about your civilizing mission no longer match what people at the edges are living. Britain reached that point slowly, then suddenly. Wars accelerated it. Independence movements hardened it. American power overshadowed it. The empire didn't vanish in a single theatrical collapse. It was dismantled, bargained over, mismanaged, mourned, sometimes violently resisted, sometimes even welcomed. What mattered for the people in the middle of it wasn't the exact date a colony was granted independence. What mattered was the feeling. We were the center. Now we are just one country among others. What does that make us? Tucker's question, what happened to Britain, is really that question. It's not about Poland. It's about going from imperial gravity well to medium-sized nation, from the sun never sets, to the trains are late, and the hospitals are full. From believing the world is arranged around you to realizing it mostly isn't anymore. Once you see empire as a system, you stop asking, why did Britain interfere? And start asking, how could it not? You stop imagining decline as a sudden moral collapse and start seeing it as the slow, inevitable consequence of being overextended for too long. That doesn't mean you shrug and say, oh, well, physics, and absolve everyone. There were choices, needless cruelties, catastrophic missteps, missed chances to share power more justly or withdraw more gracefully. But it does mean that sitting in a television studio 80 years later and asking, in tones of injured innocence, why Britain got involved in someone else's war is like asking why a man who spent his life juggling knives eventually cut his hand. There are more interesting questions. What did juggling do to him? What did it do to the people who had to stand still while he performed? And who is paying now for the scars he left behind? Those questions belong more to Dickens and Orwell than to the pundits. They are questions about cost, not just glory, about strain, not just victory. They are also the questions you have to ask if you want to love a post-imperial Britain honestly, not as a lost empire, but as a country that once tried to hold too much of the world in its hands and now has to learn how to live without the weight.
Chapter 3. The Myth of Great Men and the Mud Under Their Boots. One of the lines in that Piers-Tucker conversation stuck with me more than the rest. Piers said, almost with a sigh, that Britain is now ruled by small people. You hear versions of that all over the West. We used to have giants. Now we have pygmies. The implication is always the same. Once upon a time, serious men carried the weight of history on their shoulders. Today, clowns in suits scroll their phones and check poll numbers. There's a seduction in that story. It flatters the dead and insults the living in one move. It makes us feel like we were born too late for heroism. It also depends on a trick. It compares the reality of today's politicians to the myth of those who came before. Not the real Churchill, not the real Napoleon, not the real men who barked orders that killed millions. The poster, The statue. The framed, carefully lit version in the steakhouse. Take Napoleon. On paper. Emperor of the French, reformer of law, reshaper of Europe, name echoing through history books and war colleges. The great general, the strategic genius, the man whose shadow still falls over Paris. In reality, a bright, furious Corsican with a chip on his shoulder the size of a continent. Shorter than many of the men he commanded, mocked for his accent when he first arrived in France. Always slightly out of place among the old aristocracy. Ambitious in the way only someone who has tasted humiliation can be. Hitler, different continent, different time, brutally different outcome, carries the same emotional odor. A failed art school applicant, drifting and aggrieved, obsessed with his own sense of injury, turning personal resentment into a politics of annihilation. These are not gods descended from Olympus. They are small men with oversized projects. That's not an insult. It's a diagnosis. You don't try to rearrange the map of Europe unless something is burning inside you, something that says, I am owed more space than the world has given me. The world obliges for a while. Then it collapses on you. I say this not as someone who has always been immune to the myth, but as someone who swallowed it early. As a child in France, I was haunted by Napoleon. Paris is full of ghosts, and his is one of the loudest. I remember visits to Les Invalides, walking under the Great Dome, approaching his tomb as if I were entering the lair of a dragon. There was a horse nearby, stuffed, preserved, presented as the emperor's noble companion. I begged my father to take me to see it. I stared at that animal, at the empty saddle, at the red of the fabrics and the gold of the harness, and I didn't see a man who had left Europe littered with bodies. I saw a legend. I felt something electrical in my skin, a thrill that had nothing to do with spreadsheets of casualties and everything to do with the idea of one man bending history. Years later, in a steakhouse in Austin, I saw his face on a wall, a decorative Napoleon hanging near a bar, and that same irrational charge went through me. Some part of me is still the French child who wants the emperor to be special. We don't just inherit myths through school books. We inherit them through emotion. We feel them before we can question them. That's why I'm careful when I hear talk about small people ruling us now. We are very good at editing the dead. We cut away the boring parts, the petty cruelties, the bad jokes, the stomach problems, the hangovers. We keep the speeches and battles and paintings. We sand down the contradictions. The Churchill people remember when they say we used to have real leaders is not the man stumbling through his own depressions and political blunders. It's the chin, the cigar, the bulldog pose against Nazism. A pose that mattered, yes, but also a pose that has been frozen, curated, polished. If you gave our current leaders another 100 years of selective memory and marble and museum lighting, many of them would also look enormous. If you could resurrect film of Napoleon trying to manage logistics or Hitler sulking over minor slights, they would shrink. We do not compare like with like. We compare our raw footage to their edited highlights. No wonder the present feels small. This isn't to say there is no difference between then and now. There is. Today's leaders are tethered to polls, donors, and 24-hour outrage cycles in ways their predecessors never were. Many of them genuinely are shallow, reactive, and terrified of boredom. You can see the hollowness in their eyes sometimes, the sense that they're playing a role whose script they didn't write and don't fully understand. But if you peel back a layer, the psychological machinery is old. Some of our billionaires, for example, are just new Napoleons in hoodies. Boys who once felt invisible now flying rockets and buying platforms, desperate to prove to a planet that they matter. Some of our populist politicians are Hitler in miniature, not in their scale of evil, but in their emotional structure. Grievance turned outward, ego masquerading as destiny. The details change, the platforms change, the suits and uniforms change. The human heart remains painfully consistent. Smallness overcompensating for itself. childhood wounds dressing up as historical missions, insecurity with an army. So when Piers Morgan says, "We used to be ruled by big people and now we're ruled by small people," I want to pause him gently and ask, how sure are you about the size of the dead? If you could sit in a room with Napoleon for an hour without the uniform and the music, if you could listen to Hitler talk about his early failures without the party banners, would they really feel like giants? Or would they feel like a type you already know? The insecure colleague, the volatile boss, the man who never stops talking about himself? My point is not that all leaders are the same or that moral differences don't matter. They do. The world owes a debt to some of those small men who managed at key moments to be brave in the right direction. Others drove nations into horror. The record is not flat. But the myth of the giant is a problem. Because as long as we tell ourselves that only colossal, almost superhuman figures can carry a country, we will keep oscillating between disillusionment and idolatry. The present will always feel disappointing. The past will always glow artificially. And we will miss the quiet truth that most of what keeps a country livable is not done by heroes at all. Britain, in particular, has been very skillful at chiseling its history into statues and slogans. The greatest Britain, they call Churchill. Napoleon has his tomb. Victoria has her memorial. Even the anonymous soldier has his cenotaph. All of that has its place. Ritual matters. Memory matters. But if you ask where Britain's soul has actually been shaped, you don't end up at the plinths. You end up in the pages of people who were not in charge. In Dickens's portraits of clerks and orphans and debtors. In Orwell's essays about coal miners and clerks and tramps. In the diaries of ordinary soldiers and factory workers and nurses. The myth of the great man is loud. The texture of real greatness is quiet. When we talk about decline and small leaders, we are really talking about a crisis of imagination. We can't picture a country being worth loving without a giant at the top. We don't know how to tell a story in which the main character is not an emperor or a prime minister, but a street full of people just trying to live decently. Part of Britain's work now, part of the West's work, is to give up on the idea that salvation will arrive in the shape of another Churchill, another Napoleon, another oversized personality who will make us feel big again. That doesn't mean giving up on leadership. It means changing what we think leadership is for, not to inflate the national ego, not to restore a lost myth, but to make it possible for millions of small lives to be lived with less fear, less humiliation, less hunger, less noise. In that sense, maybe Piers is accidentally right. We are ruled by small people. We always have been. The question is not how to find bigger ones, but how to stop expecting mythological size from fragile human beings, and how to build a country that does not need a legend in order to be worth saving.
Chapter 4. Where Britain's real greatness was forged: slums, smoke, and sentences. When people say, Britain used to be great, they rarely mean Tom All-Alone's. They don't mean the rotting slum in Bleak House, where damp crawls up the walls and disease comes up through the floorboards. They don't mean the workhouses, where children were fed just enough to keep the machinery running, or the graveyards where the poor were stacked, forgotten, under cheap stone. But that's where Britain's language learned to speak the truth. Not in palaces, in places that smelled of coal smoke, sewage, and despair. By the time Charles Dickens began writing in the 1830s, London was the beating heart of what would later be called Britain's imperial century. The empire was expanding, trade routes were thick with ships, and the country had become the leading industrial power in Europe. From above, it must have been intoxicating. Maps shaded in red, factories pouring out steel and textiles, railways stretching over the countryside like veins. It looked like triumph. At street level, it looked different. In the alleys and tenements Dickens walked, life expectancy for the poor could be as low as 22 years. Slums that defy description, one historian wrote, were packed with children who worked in factories, slept in overcrowded rooms, or were simply turned out when their parents couldn't feed them. The workhouses, the supposed safety net, were their own kind of punishment. Disease flowed through bad water and worse housing: cholera, typhoid, infections that turned whole neighborhoods into slow disasters. This is the soil out of which Oliver Twist grows, not out of some elevated national spirit, but out of hunger and humiliation, debtors' prisons and child labor. Dickens wasn't writing postcards from a glorious age. He was writing indictments. He loved his country enough to tell it what it was doing to its own. He loved language enough to use it like a sledgehammer. When Tucker talks about Britain reinventing civilization, and when people speak of the greatness of British literature, they often imagine the finished product: the novels, the sentences, the classrooms where those books are taught. They don't picture the raw material. They don't picture a 12-year-old Dickens working in a factory while his father sits in a debtor's prison. They don't picture the children sweeping chimneys or carrying coal. They don't picture the way the rich read about all this suffering in the morning paper and still told themselves the empire was a gift to the world. But that's where the beautiful language comes from. It is not poured from a crystal decanter on a mahogany desk. It is distilled, drop by drop, from the lives of people who had every reason to despair and chose instead to put their pain into words. British literature didn't float down from some moral high ground. It was dug out of the mud. George Orwell stands on the other end of that same road. By the time he writes Politics and the English Language in 1946, the formal empire is beginning to fray. The Second World War has emptied Britain's coffers. Independence movements are gathering strength. The old imperial confidence is leaking away. Orwell looks up from this world and sees something that horrifies him. The English language itself is going cloudy. Political writing is full of ugly and inaccurate phrases, ready-made slogans, words that sound important but carry almost no meaning. He notices that language is being used less to reveal the truth and more to smother it, to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable. In other words, as the empire's contradictions sharpen, its language becomes more evasive. You can't keep telling people you rule them for their own good without eventually twisting your own tongue into knots. You can't bomb villages and still say civilization with a straight face. Not forever. The words start to slur. Orwell, like Dickens, responds by going the other way. Where Dickens drags the reader through fog and filth so they can't pretend not to see it, Orwell drags the reader through their own sentences. He shows them clichés, dead metaphors, passive voice, political jargon. He insists that clarity is not a luxury. It is a moral act. If you clean the language, you make it harder to hide cruelty. Dickens attacks the empire's conscience. Orwell attacks its vocabulary. Both men are saying the same thing in different centuries. If you want a decent country, start by telling the truth about what is happening in front of you. This is why I cannot take seriously any vision of Britain's glorious past that does not pass through their pages. If your Britain is all Spitfires and Shakespeare, but no workhouses, no coal mines, no colonial famines, no fog-shrouded courts, and no bureaucratic lies, then what you love is not a country. It's a costume. The real thing is harder to love because it contains both the cruelty and the people who stood up to it. And yet, that is exactly what makes it lovable. There is something profoundly moving about a society that produces its own witnesses, a place that builds slums and then produces a Dickens to shame it, that wages dirty wars and then produces an Orwell to strip its language bare, that erects monuments to conquest and then fills them with nervous tourists reading plaques that whisper gently, "You stole this." Take Paris, for example, with its Luxor obelisk standing in Place de la Concorde. dragged from Egypt in the 19th century and planted where Louis XVI lost his head. It's an almost too perfect symbol of empire, something taken from the periphery, set up in the old centre of power, admired by people who rarely think about the ship that carried it there. London has its own version of this. The museums and trophies of an age when taking things from others was considered proof of your importance. But it also has the voices that refuse to let those trophies tell the whole story. When I think about my own writing, the part of me that calls itself Elias Winter, I don't feel like I'm doing something new. I feel like I'm joining a queue. I walked through London as a younger man, long after Dickens, long after Orwell, working jobs that had nothing to do with literature. I rode the tube, watched drunk office workers spill out into the street at night, saw rough sleepers in doorways and school kids in uniforms laughing too loudly, as if volume alone could keep the future away. Later, in America, I saw something similar but harsher. Tents under overpasses, bodies on sidewalks twitching under fentanyl, people talking to themselves under freeway lights. On nights when I couldn't sleep, I walked across bridges and looked down at the water and thought, this is where the sentences come from. Not from think tanks, not from panel shows. From the places where a country breaks its own heart and tries to pretend it hasn't. In that sense, my work about America is not separate from my love for Britain. They are part of the same apprenticeship, learning to look at a place without flinching, then trying to speak about it without lying. So when Tucker and Piers invoke Britain's past as something greater than today, I don't argue with them by waving another flag. I argue with them by opening a book. Show me the greatness, I want to say. Show me the greatness that isn't paid for by children in factories and men in mines and colonized subjects wondering why they are starving so someone else can call himself civilized. Show me a Britain whose genius doesn't depend on someone else's silence. They can't. No one can. Because that Britain never existed. The one that did exist is more complicated, more compromised, and, because of that, more real. It gave us empires and obelisks and railways and famine and fog and slums. It also gave us the people who, faced with all that, picked up a pen. If there is any hope for Britain now, it is not in going back to an empire that no longer exists, or in summoning another great man to stand in front of a green screen and tell us comforting lies. It is in remembering its truest tradition, to look at itself unsparingly, to describe what it sees in a language clear enough that no one can claim not to understand, and to let that clarity hurt just enough that change becomes possible. Chapter 5. Anger, Boats, Algorithms, and a Hope for Britain. I've been hard on Tucker and Piers, and on the myths they speak for. Before this ends, I want to turn away from the studio lights and go somewhere quieter. I want to stand, at least in my mind, in front of a British school. The bell's gone. Kids are spilling out in uniforms, shouting, kicking at the air, glued to their phones. Behind them, a block of flats in need of repair. In front of them, a road with potholes that never quite get fixed. Somewhere in their homes, a parent is waiting for an NHS appointment that's been pushed back for the third time. This is also Britain. No trumpets, no empire, no finest hour. Just children walking home in a country that doesn't entirely know what it is anymore. When I see footage of riots, broken shop windows, police lines, crowds roaring, I always find myself thinking of those kids first. Not because I romanticize them or think they're all secret philosophers, just because I know how much humiliation a human soul can absorb before it looks for fire. Inequality is not new. Under Louis XIV, peasants watched carts of food roll past while they starved. In Dickens's London, beggars and orphans existed a short carriage ride away from lavish dinner parties. The poor have always had reasons to be angry. What's new is the screen. Oliver Twist did not have a smartphone. He did not lie in bed at night scrolling through videos of mansions, luxury cars, private jets, and staged day-in-the-life clips shot in rented apartments. He did not wake up every morning reminded, in high definition, of everything he would never have. He knew he was poor, but his comparison set was local: the workhouse, the street, the market. The rich were rumours and glimpses. A 15-year-old in Birmingham or Glasgow or the outskirts of London no longer has that mercy. He wakes up and with a swipe can place his life next to a billionaire's or a fraud who dresses like one. He can measure his bedroom against a Dubai penthouse and his trainers against someone's 10th pair of designer shoes. He can listen to people his age in other countries talking about opportunities he will never see. The body can endure hunger longer than the ego can endure humiliation. And humiliation is cheap now. It's in your pocket. When I say I wish I could stand in a classroom and ask these kids, "What are you angry about?" I'm not being sentimental. I'm deadly serious. Because if you don't let people articulate their anger, someone else will articulate it for them. They will tell them the story is simple. You are poor because of them. Your hospital is broken because of them. Your housing list is long because of them. Your country is changed because of them. And them is always someone who can't answer back. It is easier to blame the person off the boat than the person who sold the port. This is where the small boats come in. Tiny vessels on cold water, overloaded with people who have already lost more than most of us can imagine. They arrive on British shores and are immediately turned into symbols. Invasion for some, salvation for others, a problem for almost everyone. I am not naive about the strain that chaotic migration can put on a state. I am not blind to the fact that borders are real and policies matter. I am not one of those people who thinks compassion means pretending that capacity and order don't exist. But I can't help noticing how perfectly the boats fit into a very old pattern. For a government under pressure, for a political class that has overseen stagnant wages, crumbling infrastructure, and an NHS that feels permanently on the brink, the small boats are a blessing in a very dark way. When people are furious about their lives getting worse, it is dangerous, for the people at the top, if they start asking, who ran this country for the last 30 years? Much safer if they ask, who just arrived last week? Much safer if the crowd walks past the glass towers and the private clubs and the homes with second kitchens and marches instead to the hotel where the migrants are being housed. The French women of 1789 marched to Versailles and demanded the head of Marie Antoinette. In our time, imagine them marching to a 3-star hotel off a motorway and demanding the head of a Sudanese teenager who crossed the channel in a rubber dinghy. How convenient for the modern Marie Antoinettes that such a transfer of rage is possible. No leaked memo will ever prove that anyone in power sits in a room and says, "Let the boats keep coming. This is politically useful." History doesn't usually work like that, but incentives are real even when they are not spoken aloud. If your entire system runs on not being blamed, anything that distracts from your own responsibility becomes, silently, part of the structure. This is where Tucker and I part ways most clearly. He looks at the boats and sees, above all, a border problem, a sovereignty problem, an identity problem. He sees a Britain invaded by people who do not belong. I look at the boats and see, first, a suffering problem. People who climbed into those rafts did not do it because Britain is weak. They did it because life behind them had become unlivable. I also see a political problem, not the one on the posters, but the one in the shadows. These people, who can barely speak the language, who have no vote, who are grateful just to be alive, are being used as lightning rods. I am not pro-illegal immigration. I am against systems that need illegality and chaos because they are too convenient as excuses. I am against the way migrant bodies are turned into screens onto which a country can project its fears, instead of looking at the building failures that created those fears in the first place. Decades of underinvestment, a housing market that treats homes like chips in a casino, public services stretched to the breaking point, a culture that tells people they are nothing if they are not winning. These things make people righteously angry. They should. What frightens me is not the anger, it's where it is being pointed. So where is the hope in all this? If the empire is gone, the myths are fraying, the boats keep coming, the kids keep scrolling, the hospitals keep creaking. What exactly am I asking Britain to be hopeful about? Not a return to anything. That path is closed. The British Empire will not be rebuilt. The world is not waiting for London to run it again. The map will not turn red a second time. Any politician who suggests otherwise is selling you a costume, not a future. But empires are not the only way for a country to matter. Britain's real genius was never the size of its fleet. It was the stubbornness of its conscience and the precision of its language. It was the ability to produce, in every age, people willing to stand up and say, "This is what is happening. This is what it feels like. This is what we are doing to each other." Sometimes they were novelists, sometimes journalists, sometimes comedians, preachers, trade unionists, nurses writing in diaries. A long, uneven line of witnesses. The empire needed them less than the Britain that came after does. Because a post-imperial country has a different task, not to impress the world, but to live honestly in it. Not to dominate others, but to treat its own people in a way that doesn't require so many lies. Hope, for me, looks like this. A Britain where the word decline is finally retired, not because everything is fine, but because the frame has changed. Where the question is no longer, why aren't we as big as we used to be? But, are we fairer than we used to be? Kinder? More truthful? A Britain where the anger of the young is listened to, not indulged in everything, but taken seriously enough that they no longer need to burn anything to be heard. A Britain where the boats are handled with firmness and humanity, and where no minister is allowed to use them as a permanent excuse for every broken thing. A Britain where Dickens and Orwell are not just school assignments, but guides, one reminding us never to look away from suffering, the other reminding us never to let the language that describes it be corrupted, and perhaps, quietly, a Britain that recognizes that people like me, Iranians, French, migrants, and guests and former residents, are not trespassing when we speak about it. We are part of the strange, extended family that its empire created against its own intentions. We carry some of its streets inside us. We worry about it from afar. We love it in a way that is not based on childhood nostalgia or blood, but on the stubborn, inconvenient affection that comes from really seeing a place and refusing to give up on it. When I watched Tucker and Piers talk about Britain, what I heard underneath the showmanship was grief. Grief for an imagined past, grief for a real present. Grief is not a bad place to start. It means you have loved something and noticed that it is changing. But if you stay there too long, it curdles into resentment, into fantasies of purity, into rage at the wrong people. What Britain needs now is not another performance of that grief on television. It needs what it has always secretly had at its best. People willing to tell truer stories about it than the ones it tells about itself. Stories that remember the slums as well as the speeches, the boats as well as the battles, the kids on their phones as well as the kings in their portraits. Stories that make room at the end, not just for anger at what has been lost, but for a quieter, more demanding feeling. Love for what might still be built here, on this island, after the story. Once the empire is gone and the myths have been laid down, and the country finally has both hands free. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.